Welcome. You have found a quiet place. There is nothing here that needs your urgent attention. There are no decisions to be made, no alarms waiting, no bright light demanding anything of you. Only this, a long, unhurried walk through a piece of the past. A building that stood solid and grey in the English landscape for most of the 19th century and well into the 20th. A place that was, in its own way, both ordinary and profound. Tonight, we are going to spend a quiet evening inside a Victorian workhouse. Not to be disturbed by it, not to be frightened, but simply to understand it, to walk slowly along its corridors, to hear the bell that marked the hours, to see the hands at work and the figures asleep in the long dormitories. To sit for a while with the ordinary people who passed through those gates, and to understand something of the lives they lived there. So, settle yourself. Let your breathing slow. There is plenty of time. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the English landscape was full of workhouses. They stood on the edges of market towns and at the margins of cities. They were built of local brick, often 2 or 3 stories high, with long windows and plain facades. They did not announce themselves, they simply existed, solid, utilitarian, impossible to ignore once you knew what you were looking at. The building you might approach on a cold autumn evening would look something like this. A pair of iron gates set into a low wall. Beyond the gates, a yard, and beyond the yard, the main building, broader than it was tall, with wings extending to either side. The smoke from its chimneys rising slowly into a grey sky. The windows lit, faintly, with the pale light of oil lamps, or, in later years, gas jets. There would be a lodge just inside the gate. A porter's room, probably. A small window through which a face might appear to ask your business. The path that brought a person to those gates was rarely a simple one. It was, almost always, a path of last resort. The final point arrived at after everything else had been tried. After the savings had gone. After the relatives had done what they could. After the work had dried up and the rent had fallen behind, and the children had eaten the last of what was in the house. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had reshaped the way England dealt with its poor. Before it, relief, money or goods given to people who could not support themselves, had been distributed in many forms and in many places. After it, the expectation was that, except in special circumstances, anyone seeking help from the public purse would need to enter a workhouse to receive it. The parishes of England were grouped into poor law unions, each union responsible for building and maintaining a workhouse, each governed by a board of guardians elected by local ratepayers. The principle at the heart of this system was called less eligibility. Life inside the workhouse, the reformers believed, must be less eligible, less comfortable, less desirable than the life of the lowest independent labourer outside it. This was not cruelty for its own sake, at least not in the minds of those who designed it. It was deterrence. It was meant to ensure that only those who had truly no other option would come. And so those who came to the gate on a dark November evening or a raw February morning were people who had reached that point, the point at which there was no other option. The elderly woman whose family had died or moved away. The man whose trade had collapsed and whose landlord had grown tired of waiting. The young woman who was unmarried and expecting a child with nowhere else to go. The family, father, mother, children, who had walked many miles because the town they had come from had nothing left to offer them. They would stand at the gate and ring or knock and wait. The first person a new arrival encountered was often the porter or the relieving officer, a man whose job it was to assess applications for relief and decide who should be referred for admission. The process was not brutal in its outward form. There was a room, there was a table, and on the table, a ledger. There were questions: name, age, parish of origin, reason for applying, whether there were dependents. The man or the woman or the family would answer as best they could. Their voices, perhaps, very quiet. Their hands, perhaps, very still. The Board of Guardians held formal authority to authorize admission, but in practice, the decision was often made by the master, the man who ran the workhouse day to day, or by the relieving officer acting on the board's general instructions. For many arrivals, admission was a formality once the basic facts had been established. New arrivals were placed first in a receiving ward, sometimes called a probationary ward. This was a holding space, separate from the rest of the building. It existed for a practical reason. Before anyone was allowed into the main house, a medical officer needed to examine them. If a person was carrying an infectious illness, fever, smallpox, the many ailments that moved quickly through enclosed populations, they would be directed to the sick ward rather than the general wards. The receiving ward was a pause, a transitional space between the world outside and the world inside. In that ward, a series of things would happen that many residents would later describe as among the most unsettling aspects of the entire experience. They would be stripped of their clothing, their clothes and any personal possessions, a comb, a prayer book, a photograph, a small coin kept for luck, would be taken, washed or disinfected, carefully wrapped or catalogued, and stored. They would be told that these things would be returned to them when they left. They would be bathed, and then they would be issued with their uniform. The uniform varied slightly from union to union, but the effect was the same everywhere. For men, typically a coarse jacket and trousers, grey or blue, rough to the touch. For women, a grey or brown dress, an apron, a bonnet, or cap. Children would be dressed similarly to the adults of their sex. The clothes were not cruel in themselves, they were warm, they were serviceable, but they were not yours. They marked you, in the plainest visual terms, as someone who had entered the system. Children's hair might be cut on admission, a practical measure against lice officially, but a thing that many children and their parents felt deeply. Let us stay for a moment in that receiving ward, because it is worth understanding what it felt like to cross that threshold, not in dramatic terms, but in the quieter, more persistent terms of what was lost. You had arrived with almost nothing, and yet you had arrived with your name, your history, the weight of the life you had lived. You had arrived with the coat your father had owned, or the shawl your sister had given you, or the small Bible that had been with you since you were confirmed. And now those things were in a bundle in a storeroom somewhere in the building, labeled with a number. You were wearing a uniform. The uniform was not merely practical, it was a signal to yourself and to everyone around you that you had crossed a line. That the ordinary life, the life in which you made your own choices about what to wear, what to eat, when to rise, was, for the time being, suspended. You were in a system now, and the system had its own logic, its own rhythms, its own expectations. This was not done from malice. The people who designed these systems genuinely believed they were providing something necessary and even beneficial. The uniform prevented inequality within the house. No one was better dressed than anyone else. The confiscation of possessions prevented theft and disorder. The medical examination protected the health of everyone inside. And yet, the person sitting in the receiving ward, in a uniform that was not their own, waiting to be directed to their ward, was experiencing something real and significant. They had entered a space in which their individual identity, their name, their history, their personal objects, had been, however temporarily, set aside. They were now a resident of the workhouse. They would be addressed by their surname, if at all. They would sleep in a room with many others. They would eat at a table with many others. They would follow the same timetable as everyone else. The workhouse was not a single, undifferentiated space. It was, in fact, a carefully partitioned institution, divided by age, by sex, by physical condition, and by what the Victorian administrative mind considered class. The main categories were able-bodied men, able-bodied women, aged and infirm men, aged and infirm women, and children. Each group had its own wards, its own yard, its own day room. The yards were divided by high walls so that the different groups could move about in the open air without encountering one another. And this is where the most painful aspect of the admission process became fully apparent. Families were separated. A husband and wife who had walked to the gate together, who had perhaps held each other's hands in the queue outside the porter's lodge, would be directed to different parts of the building. The able-bodied men went one way, the women went another. The children, depending on their age and sex, went to a third place, and perhaps a fourth. A father might not see his children for days. A mother might catch sight of her son at a distance across a yard, and that might be the only contact permitted between them. This policy was deliberate. It was, again, a deterrent, a way of making the workhouse experience uncomfortable enough that families would want to leave as soon as they were able. But for those who had no means of leaving, who had nowhere else to go, the separation was not a temporary discomfort. It was a sustained reality of daily life. Under 7 children could sometimes remain with their mothers, at least initially, and this was a relief that many women valued enormously. Discretion rested with the master. There was no guarantee. Parents were allowed to see their children, but again, this was a matter of discretion. The meetings, when they happened, took place in a day room or a supervised space, not in private, not for long. The walls of the workhouse were not merely physical. They divided not just the building. Life inside the workhouse was governed by the bell. The bell was the first sound of the day and the last. It marked the beginning of work and the end of work. It called residents to meals. It signaled prayers. In a building where clocks might be scarce and where many residents had never owned a watch, the bell was time itself. The 1835 regulations prescribed a daily routine in careful detail. There were 2 seasonal variants, adjusted for the length of the daylight hours. Between the 25th of March and the 29th of September, the longer days, the warmer months, residents would rise at 6 in the morning. Half an hour after rising, there would be a roll call to account for everyone in the building. Breakfast would be served between 6:30 and 7. Work would begin at 7 and continue until noon, when an hour would be allowed for dinner. Work would resume and continue until 6 in the evening. Supper would follow between 6 and 7. Bed at 8. Between the 29th of September and the 25th of March, The shorter days, the months of cold and early dark, the schedule shifted by an hour. Rise at 7, roll call at past, breakfast between 7:30 and 8, work from 8 until noon, an hour for dinner, work resumed until 6, supper between 6 and 7, bed at 8. The hour between 7 and 8 in the evening was, in the early regulations, neither specified nor forbidden. It was, in practice, a kind of recreation time, a brief interval between supper and bed in which residents might sit in the day room or in the yard if the weather permitted. In later decades, books and magazines were sometimes provided. There were occasional talks or musical evenings in some workhouses. The evenings were quiet, but they were not entirely without their small consolations. Prayers were said before breakfast and after supper each day. On Sundays, on Good Friday, and on Christmas Day, divine service was held, and on those days no work was required except what was absolutely necessary for the running of the house: cooking, some cleaning, the basic maintenance of the institution. These were, in their own modest way, days of rest. The morning roll call was a practical measure. People could leave the workhouse. It was not a prison, and residents who wished to go could give notice and depart. But the building needed to know who was inside it. The roll call, half an hour after rising, ensured that the books were accurate, that everyone was accounted for, that the day could begin in good order. And so it did, day after day. The bell rang, the day room doors opened, the corridor filled, briefly, with the sound of footsteps. The dining hall was the room in which the largest number of people gathered at once, and it was a room that had its own particular quality of silence. The residents entered and took their places on long benches arranged in rows. The benches faced the same direction, not across a table from one another, but side by side, looking towards the end of the hall. This was not an architectural accident. It was a design choice, intended to discourage conversation, to keep order, to transform the act of eating from a social event into something more like a supervised necessity. In the early years of the system, silence at meals was explicitly required by the rules. The regulations called for silence, order, and decorum. Residents were not to speak during meal times. They were to eat what was placed before them, in the time allotted, and then return to their work. In 1842, the explicit requirement for silence was quietly removed from the wording of the rules. The meals were still to be orderly, still decorous, but the formal prohibition on speech was gone. This small change was, in practice, probably less dramatic than it sounds. The habits of a dining hall are not transformed overnight by a regulatory amendment. But it was a shift, and it is worth noting. Breakfast was gruel. The word has come to carry a particular weight in our imagination. It is the food of Dickens and deprivation, the food of Oliver Twist's famous request. And it was, in truth, a very simple thing. Oatmeal, or a mixture of flour and oatmeal, boiled in water, sometimes with a little salt, served in an earthenware bowl marked with the name of the union. A mug of something alongside it, water or thin milk, or in some workhouses, a small amount of weak beer, which was at the time considered safer to drink than much of the available water. For the aged and infirm, tea was sometimes provided. This was considered an allowance for their particular needs, a small comfort, a concession to age. The earthenware bowls were sturdy, practical things. In earlier decades, spoons were the only utensils provided. A knife and fork were not considered necessary for the meals being served. By the later part of the century, a standard set of knife, fork, and spoon had become more common. The bowls and mugs were often marked with the name of the Union: the Eastbourne Union, the Worcestershire Union, the Whitechapel Union. A small but persistent reminder with every meal of where you were and to whom the crockery belonged. The meal was eaten. The bell rang. The hall was clear. The principle that underpinned all of this was work. The workhouse was not, in its designer's intention, simply a place of shelter. It was a place where those who were able to work would work, both because their labour would contribute to the running of the institution and because work, in the Victorian moral framework, was understood as improving, steadying, a corrective to the habits that poverty was assumed to produce. The work varied by the class and physical capacity of the resident. Able-bodied men were given the heaviest tasks. Stone breaking was common, a yard in which large stones were broken into smaller pieces suitable for road making, the work done with a hammer, hour after hour, in all weathers. Oakum picking was another standard task. The unpicking of old rope, typically worn-out naval rope, tarred and stiff, into its constituent fibres, so that the fibres could be used for caulking ships or other purposes. The work was done with the fingers, and it was hard on the hands. The skin was cut and worn. The tar stained deeply. It was monotonous work, repetitive work, work that required no thought and permitted none. That, in a sense, was the point. Other men worked in the gardens, which in larger workhouses could be substantial. Orchards and vegetable plots that supplied a significant portion of the food eaten inside. Some worked in the piggery or the bakery, or helped with the heavy maintenance of the building itself. Able-bodied women had their own set of tasks. Laundry was the great constant. Great quantities of it, sheets and uniforms, and the daily linen of a large institution, washed by hand in copper tubs, wrung, hung, and ironed. Women also cleaned the wards, scrubbed the floors of the day rooms and corridors, worked in the kitchen, preparing meals, and sewed, mending the uniforms and linens of the house, making and repairing the practical textiles that the institution constantly required. There were also skilled craftsmen among the residents, and some workhouses maintained workshops where these skills were put to use. A tailor's room where garments were cut and sewn. A shoemaker's room where boots were repaired or made. These were quieter places, more focused, with the particular kind of still industry that craft work produces. The smell of leather, the soft rhythm of needle through cloth. The workrooms were not comfortable, but they were warm, which was not nothing in a cold winter. The windows let in whatever light the day provided. The sound of work, the hammer on stone, the slap of wet laundry, the scrape of a brush across stone flags, became the background sound of the day as regular. Let us spend a little longer in the laundry, because it was one of the rooms in which the greatest number of women spent the greatest number of hours, and because it had a quality to it that is worth attending to. The laundry of a large workhouse was a substantial operation. It was a room, or more often a series of rooms, where the entire institutional linen was processed each week. Think of the quantity. The sheets from hundreds of beds, the uniforms worn by hundreds of residents, the tablecloths and aprons and towels and rags, all of it washed by hand. The copper tubs were large, fired from below with wood or coal. The water in them was very hot, and the steam rose thickly, so that the laundry on a cold morning was one of the warmest rooms in the building. The women worked with their sleeves rolled up, their hands red and chapped, lifting and scrubbing, rinsing in cold water, wringing by hand, or later, through a mangle, carrying the wet weight of clean linen to the drying racks or out to the yard. The rhythm of laundry work is deeply repetitive. The same motions repeated, the same sequence of soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing. There is a particular quality to very repetitive physical work, a way in which the mind can, if it is allowed, find a kind of rest in the rhythm. Not pleasure exactly, not happiness, but a settledness, a way of existing inside the moment without needing to be anywhere else. Whether the women who worked in those laundries experienced it this way is not something we can know. What we can say is that the work was done, day after day, with care and thoroughness. The linen came back clean. The institution ran. Beyond the laundry, there was the kitchen, a large room with long ranges where the meals for hundreds of people were prepared each day. Bread was baked in the workhouse bakery. Gruel was made in quantities that required large pots and long stirring. Broth, made from the water in which meat had been boiled, with vegetables added, was prepared for dinner on the days when it appeared on the dietary table. Potatoes were peeled, vegetables prepared, puddings made from suet, and whatever was available and cheap. The kitchen was a place of considerable activity in the hours before each meal, and of considerable quiet in the hours after. The women who worked there moved between the ranges and the preparation tables, their breath visible in winter before the fires were properly lit, their faces flushed in summer when the heat built through the morning. It was, in its way, a domestic life. Not a chosen domestic life. In 1839, a survey of workhouses in England and Wales found that of the 97,510 people then resident in those institutions, 42,767 were children. That is almost half. Children were, in fact, the single largest category of workhouse resident throughout much of the 19th century. Their presence there was the result of many circumstances. Orphaned children whose parents had died and who had no other family to take them. Children of single mothers who had no means of support. The children of families who had entered together and been separated on admission. Children abandoned or found in circumstances of destitution. The regulations divided children into classes: girls under the age of 16, boys under the age of 13, and a separate class for children under 7. Very young children, those under 7, could sometimes remain with their mothers, or at least be housed in the women's section of the building rather than the children's wards. This was not guaranteed. It depended on the arrangements of the particular workhouse, the inclinations of the master, and the practical capacity of the building. Education was a legal requirement. Every workhouse was obliged to provide at least 3 hours of working education each day, covering reading, writing, arithmetic, and Christian religion, as well as what the regulations described as training for service or useful industry. In practice, the quality of this education varied enormously. In some workhouses, there were dedicated schoolrooms, properly equipped with a qualified teacher, a schoolmaster for the boys, a schoolmistress for the girls. In others, the schoolroom was a bare room, and the teacher was whoever was available. Children learned to read. Children learned to write, and that, in a world where many people outside the workhouse received no education at all, was something. The schoolroom in a well-run workhouse was a place of a particular kind of quiet industry. The scratch of chalk on slates, the murmured sound of children reading aloud, or reciting, or working through a sum. The teacher moving between the desks. Through the windows, the workhouse yard with its high walls, and beyond the walls, the sky. For many children, the workhouse was the only home they had ever known, or the only home they could clearly remember. They ate their meals in the dining hall, slept in the dormitories, attended school, did their assigned chores, and grew up inside those walls. The Board of Guardians could, and often did, become the formal guardians of orphaned children, legally responsible for their welfare and their futures. When children left, and many did, from around the age of 14, the routes available to them were limited, but not without possibility. Girls were placed in domestic service, often with families in the local area, sometimes at a greater distance. Boys went into local trades, into apprenticeships if they could be arranged, or into the army or navy. It was not a rich inheritance, but it was a departure and a chance. The night before a child left the workhouse, they would sleep for the last time in the dormitory they had known. In the morning, their uniform would be exchanged for clothes suitable for the world outside. Their old clothes, if they had any, or clothes provided for the purpose, and they would walk out through the gate. The gate would close behind them. As the decades passed, the character of the workhouse population shifted. The system had been designed principally with the able-bodied unemployed in mind. The man out of work, the family without income, the young woman without support. But in practice, the able-bodied unemployed came and went. They entered in hard times and left when work became available. The people who stayed, who remained in the workhouse for months or years or the rest of their lives, were those who had no other option and no prospect of one. The elderly, the very sick, those with physical disabilities, those with what the 19th century called mental illness or imbecility, conditions we would now recognize as a very wide spectrum of mental health conditions and learning disabilities, some severe, many manageable, given the right support, almost none of which received anything approaching appropriate care. By the later 19th century, workhouses had become, in significant part, the institutions that cared for those whom the rest of society could not or would not accommodate. The infirmary was one of the most important rooms in the building. The infirmary was where residents who were ill were sent, and it was also in many workhouses where the aged and infirm spent most of their time. It was typically a long room, sometimes 2 or 3 rooms connected, with rows of beds along the walls. There might be a small fire at one end. There were windows which let in whatever light the day provided. The smell of the infirmary was the smell of illness and of the remedies applied to it, the particular chemical smell of the dressings and medicines available in the 19th century, mixed with the smell of the old building itself. The nursing in the early workhouses was done largely by other residents, pauper nurses drawn from among the able-bodied women. Their care was often limited by their own circumstances and by the absence of training. In the later decades of the century, paid nurses began to appear in workhouse infirmaries, and the standard of care improved in those institutions where the guardians were willing to invest in it. For the elderly residents, the workhouse infirmary was often where life ended. There was a mortuary, a small, separate building, usually at the edge of the site, where the bodies of those who died inside were kept before burial. Deaths in the workhouse were recorded in the same ledgers that recorded everything else: admissions, discharges, dietary tables, work records. A life reduced to its essential administrative details, on a page in a book, in a building that smelled of old brick and coal smoke. But the aged residents were not merely statistics. They were people who had worked for decades, who had had families and trades and homes, and who had arrived at the gate because the life they had built could no longer sustain them. They sat in the day room with the small number of possessions allowed to them. They watched the light change in the yard through the window. They slept in beds that were narrow but warm enough. There is a kind of endurance in that, a quiet, persistent endurance that asks nothing dramatic of anyone observing it, but that is, the workhouse operated according to a detailed code of regulations that governed almost every aspect of daily life. The rules covered behavior in the dining hall, in the dormitories, in the workrooms, and in the yards. They covered the treatment of workhouse property. They covered the conduct of residents towards staff, and of staff towards residents. They covered the consequences of breaking the rules, which ranged from the withdrawal of certain privileges to solitary confinement in the refractory ward, a locked room set aside for those who persistently refused to comply. The rules were posted in many workhouses on large boards in the main rooms, but since many residents could not read, they relied on verbal instruction and on watching what others did. The culture of the workhouse was transmitted not through text, but through habit, through the daily observation of how things were done. There was a particular art to living inside an institution, and those who spent any significant time in the workhouse developed it. The art of knowing when to speak and when to be silent. The art of working at a pace that was sufficient to avoid reprimand without exhausting yourself unnecessarily. The art of small, private economies. A crust saved from breakfast, a corner of the yard where the sun fell for a while in the afternoon, a knowing nod between residents who had come to understand one another without many words. Human beings are remarkably resourceful in finding the small spaces of freedom within systems that are designed to leave as little space as possible. Inspection was a persistent feature of the system. The Poor Law Board, later the Local Government Board, maintained a corps of inspectors whose job was to visit each workhouse and report on its condition, the state of the buildings, the adequacy of the food, the treatment of residents, the quality of the accounts. The reports of these inspectors are among the most useful historical records we have of life inside the workhouses, because they were produced by outsiders with an obligation to report honestly. The inspections were not always unwelcome. A good inspector arriving at a poorly run workhouse could compel improvements. The Andover scandal of the mid-1840s, in which it emerged that residents at the Andover workhouse were so hungry that they were gnawing at the bones they were supposed to be grinding for fertilizer, had led to a significant tightening of the inspection regime and a renewed scrutiny of dietary standards across the whole country. The inquiry that followed the Andover case resulted in the dissolution of the Poor Law Commission and its replacement with a new body, the Poor Law Board, more directly accountable to Parliament. The system was capable of reform, and reform did occur, though it was always slower and more reluctant than the situation demanded. The bones and the scandal they represented had at least changed something. The silence of the dining hall deserves one more moment of attention, because it was not only a rule, it was a condition that pervaded the institution more broadly. The workhouse was, structurally, a quiet place, not because those inside it were quiet by nature, but because the rules and the rhythms of the institution produced a particular kind of suppressed sound. The sound of a large number of people living closely together, doing their work, following the rules, not drawing attention to themselves. The sound of feet on stone floors, the sound of the bell, the sound of breathing. In the dormitory at night, the slow and uneven breathing of many people sleeping in a room that was always too cold in winter and too warm in summer. It was the In the early decades of the workhouse system, the dining hall served a double purpose. On weekdays, it was where meals were eaten, in the orderly silence described above. On Sundays, the benches were rearranged, or perhaps simply remained as they were, and the dining hall became the chapel. This doubling of function was not seen as incongruous at the time. The same room that marked the body's needs on weekdays marked the soul's on Sundays. There was a logic to it, a practicality that the Victorian administrators would have found entirely sensible. From the 1860s onwards, separate chapels became more common in larger workhouses. These were simple rooms, sometimes quite plain, sometimes, in wealthier unions, more elaborately fitted with pews and a modest stained glass window. They smelled of candle wax and old hymn books. The light in them, on a winter Sunday morning, came through windows that might or might not face east, and fell on a congregation that had not chosen to be there but that was, in many cases, genuinely devout. Prayers were said before breakfast and after supper every day. The morning prayer was brief, a few minutes between the end of roll call and the beginning of the meal. The evening prayer after supper, before the bell that signalled bed, was similarly short. The words were familiar. The Lord's Prayer, perhaps a collect, perhaps a few lines of scripture. Words that many of those present would have known since childhood. Words that connected the interior of the workhouse to the wider world of English religious life, from which its residents had come. On Sundays, and on the great religious holidays, Good Friday, Christmas, there was no work except what was necessary for the running of the house. These were genuine days of rest. The bell still rang, but the rhythm it imposed was different, slower. There was time to sit in the day room, or in the yard if the weather allowed. There were books in some workhouses, and in later years there might be a talk given by a local clergyman or a visiting speaker, or a musical entertainment provided by volunteers from the town. The evenings in the workhouse were, in the last hour before bed, often the quietest, and in some ways, the most human moments of the day. The formal demands of the institution, work, eating, roll call, were over for the night. Residents sat or lay on their beds or gathered in the day room in small groups. They talked, if the rules permitted, or simply existed alongside one another. The fire in the day room, if there was one, cast a low and variable light. The shadows moved on the walls. It was, in its way, an evening like many others, quiet. The bell rang at 8. In the dormitories, long rooms with rows of wooden or iron beds, each bed as narrow as 2 feet across in some of the older buildings, the residents arranged themselves for sleep. The mattresses were filled with flock or straw. The sheets and blankets were clean, laundered in the workhouse laundry by hands you know now. There was a pillow. It was, by the standards of the very poorest lives in Victorian England, not nothing. A person sleeping in the workhouse dormitory was at least warm, at least sheltered from the weather, at least fed, however plainly, and in a bed. This is not to minimize the cost of being there. It is simply to note that the alternative, for many who came through those gates, was the street, or a cellar, or a barn. The workhouse was not the worst place a person could be. It was simply a hard place, with a particular kind of hardness. In the dormitory, the sound of other people settling into sleep. the creak of the iron bed frames, the distant noise of the town outside, muffled by the walls. The breathing of the person in the next bed and the person beyond them, and the long row of people stretched out in the dark. Children slept in their own dormitories or in the women's section if they were very young. The children's dormitory in the night had its own particular sound, the small movements, the occasional half-woken murmur, the restlessness of young sleep. The younger ones sometimes shared beds for warmth, for the ordinary human comfort of proximity. The master and matron lived in the building, in rooms that were modest by the standards of middle-class Victorian life, but were private, their own, with their own furniture and their own fire. The night porter made his rounds. The building settled into its night self, the same building it had been all day, but quieter now, the formal machinery of the institution at rest. In the infirmary, the night nurse, where there was one, moved between the beds. A lamp, carried carefully so as not to disturb those sleeping. The soft sound of checking, of attendance, of the small, practical kindnesses that nursing requires and that the better workhouses, in their better hours, provided. The fire in the kitchen banked low for the night, waiting for morning. The laundry, still and cold, smelling of soap. The dining hall, empty, the long benches in their rows, the earthenware bowls in their cupboards, the bell, silent on its bracket. The gate, locked. The yard, empty. The sky above the workhouse, on a clear night, full of the same stars that were visible from the fields outside, from the streets of the town, from every house in England where people were also lying in the dark, breathing, resting, letting the day go. Inside the workhouse and outside it, the same night, the same day. The Victorian workhouse system lasted in various forms for well over a century. The Poor Law Amendment Act came into force in 1834. The last workhouses did not close until the mid-20th century. Some of the buildings were repurposed, converted into hospitals, into council offices, into apartment blocks. Some were demolished. A few survive largely intact, now museums or heritage sites, their long corridors and painted regulations and rows of hooks in the clothing room preserved against the general forgetting. To walk through a former workhouse today is a particular kind of historical experience. The building is very quiet. The rooms are mostly empty. But the proportions are telling. The narrowness of the dormitory beds, the length of the dining hall, the height of the walls dividing the yards. The building was designed to hold a great many people and to keep them, in very specific ways, apart from one another. You can feel that design in the spaces. The walls know what they were for. The people who lived in those buildings left, for the most part, very little in the way of personal records. Their lives are documented in the ledgers and administrative papers of the institutions. Admission registers, dietary tables, medical records, punishment books. But their voices, their inner lives, their experience of the days described in this video are largely absent from the archive. We know what time the bell rang, but we do not know what the man in the second bed from the window thought about as he waited for sleep. We know what was in the gruel, but we do not know how it tasted to the woman who had been eating it for 3 years. This is the particular grief of social history. The closer you look at the lives of ordinary people in difficult circumstances, the more aware you become of the limits of what can be known. The ledgers tell us that a man named in the admission register was 47 years old, that he was a labourer, that he was admitted in November and discharged the following March. They do not tell us what he thought about in the dormitory at night. They do not tell us whether he found the work bearable or humiliating, or simply something to be got through. They do not tell us whether he was someone who noticed the small mercies, the warmth of the laundry room, the companionship of the man who slept in the next bed, or whether the ledger entry is all that remains of him. What we can say, with confidence, is this: the people who entered those gates were not abstractions. They were not illustrations of a social problem. They were men and women and children who had particular names and particular histories, and who were, at the moment of their arrival, in genuine need. They worked hard, in conditions that were by design uncomfortable. They endured a form of institutional life that removed from them many of the small freedoms that make daily existence bearable. They did so in most cases because they had no alternative. And then, when they could, they left. They walked back through the gate, in their own clothes, with their own possessions returned to them, and they went back into the world. Some of them found their footing. Some of them returned, in the next hard season, through the same gate. Some of them died inside. Some of them lived long lives and told their grandchildren about the time they spent in the workhouse in the way that difficult memories are sometimes told, with a particular flatness, a factual precision, a way of saying, this is what happened without saying, this is what it meant. The workhouse is part of British history, not a comfortable part, not a part we remember with pride, but a part that is worth understanding, quietly and carefully, for the same reason that all history is worth understanding, because the people in it were real, and because what happened to them happened, and that is enough of a reason to pay attention. This has been a quiet evening in a Victorian workhouse. If you are still with us, if you have found, somewhere in these long and careful hours, a kind of rest, then we are glad. There is something fitting, perhaps, in using the settled rhythms of the past as a place to let the present go quiet. If you enjoyed this video, and if the channel has become part of your sleep or your focused hours, a subscription or a like helps more people find the quiet history room. That is all we ask. The rest is yours. Sleep well.